Tağdırım egen tağdardı sensiz atırdım. Unutayın dep köngülde jangan otumdu. Jol karap kütüp жүргөндөрсүң sen nardağı.
You remained behind other post-communist countries in some aspects, but also you avoided against all odds the dire circumstances that the forces of the region should have forced you into. You neighbor the most dangerous province of communist China. Your populace is slowly no longer a big fan of Russia, but they also correctly fear China. You want more money into your budget, but the plebs keep telling you to buzz off and are moving their capital away from you. So what do you do as a leader? Well, obviously, change the flag of the country. That's the geopolitics of Kyrgyzstan for you. Let's explore.
Aksınım menin tağdırım bildim men seni. Geçirici canım ayrılmaz gayrı.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 11th featured installment of the Central Asia featured series. So, in the previous two episodes, I explained what is functional random and how did Kyrgyzstan became what it is today, namely this place sandwiched between China's most repressive province and the influence of the Russian Federation. This place that continues to be a democracy-ish, despite multiple internal and external attempts to change this. The country was supposed to be mired in civil war and battle hyperinflation more or less in perpetuity, but whatever ills the experts have predicted on this country have turned out happening in part to its neighbors. And all of that in spite of the country's corrupt and immoral political class, and thanks to its courageous people who have tried more than many other democracies to keep the political class clean and in check. But even so, on many indicators, the country still lags behind, even though, again, it's a wonder that it had come thus far without serious blowback. So in this episode, we'll take a quick look over the last 2 years or so, from slightly before my visit here, when I took these images, and until the early days of 2024, with a focus on geopolitics, which is, of course, functional random as well. And that's probably the least surprising aspect. But before we look into geopolitics, let me take you a little bit through the current economic challenges because, as you see, in a democracy, geopolitics and foreign relationships in general go through the stomach, as we say in Romania, and the road to the stomach goes through economics. And in the middle of 2022, I was able to clearly observe this. Naturally, with the war in Ukraine being the top news at the moment of my visit in Kyrgyzstan, it was also nearly the opening point of discussion with nearly everyone I was chatting with for more than 5 sentences, especially after I had mentioned where I was coming from. Because you see, unlike the United States or Laos, knowledge of geography is prevalent here, so nearly everyone knew the neighbors of Ukraine and the coastal states of the Black Sea. So the middle class, the rich, and the tradesmen, like the small business owners here at Dordoy, were either straight up in favor of Ukraine or at the very least adopting various versions of Moscovich man-bad position. The poorer, or those working in transportation, were basically Russian NPCs. It was either talking to them or reading Izvestia, not much of a difference, with the exception of the quality of the Russian language. Yeah, about that, a side note if I may. The level of foreign language skills is by far the lowest in Kyrgyzstan. To make things worse, the vast majority of the populace is firmly convinced that they are fluent in Russian, and most of the time, that's just not true. Thank goodness I had booked more days here than the minimum recommended, because if I add up the time lost trying to hold conversations, that alone is about 24 hours. Anyway, so while not exactly obvious and for different reasons, the geopolitical outlook among the plebs is equally polarized to the one noticed among the elite. This should tell us that the elite is surprisingly representative of the people, which shouldn't be a surprise in a nation under construction and a nation willing to violently overthrow leaders who step too much outside of the societal standard. The short version is this. The poor are firmly convinced that if Russia's interests and influence were to be kicked out from here, the prices of everything would skyrocket because Russian gas keep things cheap here. Now, it just so happens that this is factually wrong because the gas used in this country comes from Uzbekistan, a country whose leadership has no qualms in being at odds with Russia as a matter of routine. Just in January 24, the Russian ambassador in Uzbekistan was called up to be reminded that if their propaganda continues to denigrate their country, Tashkent will have no qualms in downgrading the relationship with Russia even further. However, there is something to be said about the Chinese danger. The more informed poor people stay pro-Russian because they fear a Chinese takeover, a view that is also common among the wealthy elite. The thing is that China is already slowly taking over Russia itself, so the idea that the Russian bear keeps the hungry Chinese tiger at bay may have held some sway 25 years ago, but it's certainly unrealistic today. With that said, while it is raw economics that dictate geopolitical outlook both among the elite and the plebs, it should also be said that it is also raw economics that are changing things. You see, in the West, the plebs form their geopolitical outlook mostly through values, but the elite forms it through economics, just like in Kyrgyzstan. What's changing is that there is a sudden rise in plebs forming their geopolitical outlook through values in Kyrgyzstan as well. And there are two sources for that: former migrant workers in Russia and Russian citizens. You see, with the escalation started in February 22, Russia's attractiveness as a place for work decreased even among the poorest people in Central Asia. Combined with a rapid economic growth in Central Asia, this triggered an exodus of guest workers from Russia, further deepening the workforce crisis in Russia itself. But where did these workers go? Well, some of them came back home. With know-how and cash, now they're slowly starting their own businesses, and with the experience of living in Russia, their word holds a bigger sway whenever they disagree with something Russian in their communities. Keep in mind that in Central Asia, the opinion of the de facto community leader routinely trumps everything. Others, however, remained migrant workers but just changed the country, and it's a scramble for them too. Firms, conglomerates, and intermediaries from the West are showing up in person here in Bishkek to try to recruit them. In 2023, at least 8,000 former Kyrgyz workers in Russia have been employed by British firms either for seasonal work or long-term contracts. That may not sound like a lot, but in a population of less than 7 million in total, 0.1% of the total population going to Britain in a single year is a lot. At least another 10,000 went to other European countries in 2023. All of these people talk back home, and they are the primary source on what's Russia and what's not Russia. And let's just say that their opinion is quite different from the Bishkek consensus. So that's one source. The other source of change are Russians who fled Moskvich for reasons of political persecution. While a lot of them indeed settled in Kazakhstan, a noticeable enough number settled here in Kyrgyzstan. And because it's a smaller country, their voice makes a bigger difference than up north, even if only because they make themselves more easily understood. But it's also a numbers game. At least 30,000 Russian citizens had fled to Kyrgyzstan in the first 3 months of the war. Add to that several thousand Belarusians too, and since then that number has doubled. Please bear in mind that the people who fled Russia from February 22 onwards tend to skew more educated, more informed, and more wealthy. That's not necessarily a good thing, but it oftentimes helps. And again, in a country of under 7 million, 60,000 Russians telling you that Moscow sucks eventually do make a dent into the public opinion. Normally, this wouldn't be a problem, but you see, the new president is really pro-Russian. The government and the parliament are not. Which is why you saw a very weird show back in October when Putin made his first foreign visit since the escalation here in Bishkek. And while in Kyrgyzstan, he basically met Japarov and only some of the leaders of the CIS. For those who don't know, please refer back to the first and second episodes of this series where I explain the intricate geopolitical treaties of the former Soviet Union. You see, Kyrgyzstan appeared to have secured an important diplomatic victory in 2021 when it received the right to host the CIS summit in October 23. But by 2023, it became a sad circle jerk, and no matter how hard President Japarov tried to hide this, it didn't quite work out. Even pro-regime think tanks in Bishkek basically said that this was a sad show because, well, it was. Still, to prevent further embarrassment, the current regime ordered a roundup of the Russian dissidents to make them shut up. As you'd expect, this had the opposite effect, as even the regime media reported on the heavy-handed tactics of the local security apparatus, particularly against Krasnaya Krysha, a Russian anti-war collective originally from St. Petersburg but relocated here to Bishkek, where there are fewer tall buildings with balconies to fall off from. If anything, Japarov's apparatus drew attention to anti-war topics and created space for an even more critical evaluation of Russia in a way that didn't exist in 2022 when I took these images. In other words, the plebs are slowly following the path of the West, where geopolitics is also judged through the prism of values and not just economics. Whether that's a good thing or not is a topic for another day, but for the purposes of this talk, this is relevant because Kyrgyzstan is a democracy, and a very virulent one at that, and very random, which means that this shift is guaranteed to change things very publicly. For instance, I went to the Ministry of Culture to file a FOIA request for all sorts of statistical data on cultural affairs in the country. If you remember from 2 episodes ago, the way to file FOIA requests in this country is weird. Public data, legally speaking, is available only if you require them in person. And since I was requiring boring stuff that the local media rarely writes about, or when they do, they write in Kyrgyz, which I don't understand, I had to go to the office in person. And while filling out the form, there were some printed explanations on it that were in Kyrgyz, so I asked the clerk to translate them for me. And when he read them, it immediately struck me that the Cyrillic alphabet isn't really a good script for this language. So I casually made the remark that they solved this in neighboring Uzbekistan by switching to a Latin-based script adapted from the Turkish version. From that, it followed a conversation on linguistics and politics in which the clerk was trying to convince me that while scientifically what I was saying is correct, nobody would propose this because it would be seen as a sign of de-Russification and thus controversial. And I was like, well, duh, that's one more reason to actually do it. In addition to the fact that, again, Turkish-style writing fits this language better. The conversation ended politely. I filed my paperwork, got my reply weeks later after I had left the country, and that was that. And then, 2 months later, this pops up. Suddenly, there is appetite for switching to the Latin script. A few months later, in March 23, as part of the Japarov administration's crackdown on those who don't cough in Cyrillic, the BBC Kyrgyz service reports that there is a strong scientific argument in favor of switching to Latin script, but politics stays in the way. And by politics, the BBC means Sadr Japarov. This would be one of the reasons I was saying in the previous episode that what's next for Kyrgyzstan may indeed be another revolution, because the parliament is slowly working to start the language reform with or without the consent of the Russophilic president. And if we judge by the history of this country, when the plebs want something, they will get it, and whoever doesn't like it is free to move to Russia or Belarus, including and especially the president. And speaking of the president, he's also facing a silent but consistent backlash on economic reforms as well. You see, the reason the country developed faster and better than all of the experts predicted is because the economy continues to function as functional random. It's not exactly Ancapistan, but pretty damn close to it, for all the good and the inconveniences that come with this. About a fifth of the Kyrgyz economy is free from government theft. Or, in the language of the regime, the shadow economy represents 21% of the GDP, to which one should add another 20 to 25% in the grey economy. And for the pharaonic projects that Comrade Japarov has in mind, there's a need for funding. So the regime tried to target the bazaars and other places that have continued to be an impenetrable black box for the local IRS. The Japarov administration went as far as to offer free apartments via a fiscal lottery in order to encourage the plebs to register their transactions. In parallel, the regime also tried to impose financial controls like in China by mandating all sorts of weird, unsecure but regime-friendly QR payments. The result? Well, nothing. The plebs won't budge. As of January 2024, some companies chose to move their fiscal turnover to Kazakhstan, South Korea, Serbia, or even to China, rather than give in to the economic demands of the current administration. That's how it started in 2010, too. First, it was entrepreneurs moving their money out of the country, then came the revolution 3 months later. Now, I'm not saying this will happen again, but I am saying that the direction is eeringly similar. And I'm also saying that de-Russification is coming here too, and there's no way to predict how it will look like. But it's a safe bet, it will be functional random. But seriously, no matter how we look at this, things here will change or progress, if you like, at the speed of freer societies. Faster than both established free societies, but much slower than in the neighboring autocracies. You know, kind of like the entire post-communist history of this place. Kyrgyzstan was slower in adopting economic reforms in the early 1990s, but in the end they came out on top precisely because there was no smartass to dictate things, and instead people were allowed to experiment. Now, this applies to the evolving geopolitics of the country as well. Unlike the immediate neighbors, and we'll cover Tajikistan and Turkmenistan in the following 3 episodes, here there is no central voice, but several competing central voices. In Tajikistan, the main concern is who will succeed Comrade Rahmon and whether the next comrade will be able to maintain the trajectory of slowly becoming China's colony rather than fastly becoming China's colony, like Russia. Here, however, geopolitics is just one aspect out of many, not even very prioritized, and it's judged through multiple lenses at once by multiple concerns and multiple actors. Which is why I compared Kyrgyzstan with Moldova so many times throughout this series, as well as in the videos I published from here back in 2022. Because it's basically a very similar situation. Whoever wants to make a decision has to grapple with the fact that you'll be herding cats. The only advantage is that there are no identity concerns like they used to be in Moldova, but other than that, everything that other post-communist countries had to go through is happening here too, or is about to happen, and more or less at the pace of Moldova. For instance, in 2023, the parliament started working on declassifying the KGB archives that remained on the territory of the republic. That may create some shockwaves. Sure, it's been over 30 years, but there might still be important figures in society today that were willing collaborators with the committee. Or, who knows, maybe we get incontrovertible evidence that some or even most of the story of the 1989 protests was entirely fabricated by the KGB. Although not very likely, few would be surprised if that turned out to be true. Well, few of those who've spent a lifetime studying the work of the Committee for the Security of the State, that is. But you can rest assured the Kyrgyz people would be pretty pissed off. That could have a geopolitical impact too. In fact, there probably is something big in those archives given the relentlessness of the presidential administration in obstructing and obfuscating the bipartisan effort in the parliament to finally get those archives opened up to the public. Oh, and by the way, since the time of my visit here and the moment I'm publishing this, the flag of Kyrgyzstan has changed. Meet the new flag, same as the old flag except darker red. But why? Well, because potato, that's why. On January 3, the administrations all over the country were very busy replacing flags. There wasn't much significant debate about this whole thing either. Or maybe I should say, the debate didn't focus on the flag, but rather on the more obvious question, with all of the things happening and all of the issues in the country, is this really a main priority? Well, the answer is yes, because Sadr Japarov doesn't seem particularly able to answer more important questions. I mean, the guy used the Kurultai to campaign for this. Okay, maybe I should explain this. The Kurultai is basically the meeting of the leaders. The name comes from the times of Genghis Khan. In the present, Kurultai is basically the press conference at the end of the Unified Cabinet meeting, or the State of the Union address, if you like, something to that effect. But it's a politically important event in which the most important issues facing the nation are addressed. Well, in 2023, the main topic was Sadyr Japarov's conversation with his father-in-law about how the flag looks bad because it looks like a sunflower more than like the sun with 40 rays. So, this is the level. As of January 2024, the leadership is replacing flags while obstructing, to the extent that they can, parliament initiatives, and all while being oblivious to the geopolitical shift not just around the country, but among its own population as well. So it is from this perspective that I'm saying that probably another revolution is coming. This time less so as a result of corruption or economic grievance, but rather for reasons of incompetence and abuse of power. Now, the Kyrgyz are accustomed with abuse of power and how to deal with that, but it would mark a first to throw out a leader for reasons of incompetence.
Düşkün zamana, zamana, zamana. O kızdan iman gitti o, gitti o, gitti o.
Ultimately, the forces around the region are unstoppable, so one way or the other, the geopolitical outlook of Kyrgyzstan will change. What remains to be debated is at what pace, with how many detours, and if that will leave the country behind for a while or not. And probably how is also a question. Will it come peacefully or not? And that's not an answer regional or global actors can provide. It's an answer that unironically resides with the Kyrgyz people. As for the forces at play, well, more on that in the 15th episode. For now, this concludes the section on Kyrgyzstan, at least the political part. We'll get back to social issues during the 16th episode. In the next episode, we'll go a little bit through a subthread of regional geopolitics, namely the Fergana Valley and the political and military conflicts between Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. I call it a subthread because this part is rarely analyzed in English because, well, it's complicated. But the last 2 years saw some positive changes to it too, most of those coming from Kyrgyzstan, which I suppose it's one of the saving graces of the Sadyr Japarov administration. Still, even though it's complicated, it's what you, those watching this, pay us for, so nevertheless, we shall persist. But until then, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous financial support. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and if you like what we do, consider becoming a member of the Donors Circle. We don't have cookies, but you get to see how these videos are constructed, you get a say in the next series, and much more. Oh, and speaking of the next series, it will be from Southeast Asia, and then Latin America, should you choose to fund it. And with all of that being said, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.
Возвращаюсь домой я к себе, улица странною кажется мне. Раз возвращаюсь домой я к себе, улица странною кажется мне. Левая, правая, где сторона? Ты, брат, пьяна, левая, правая, где сторона? Улица, улица, ты, брат, пьяна. И фонари так неярко Там рожу криво